Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Cain, and I'm joined by Dan Miller, who were part of a virtual facilitation practice group. I live in Western New York. Dan is in Western North Carolina. And we occasionally get a chance to work together and do some amazing things. So today we're going to talk about facilitating the real world, the virtual world, and the hybrid blended universe, and give you some of the tips and tricks and things that we've learned along the way. One of my favorite quotes comes from a woman named Jane Seabrook. And this is certainly the case for us at the very start of the pandemic in the early part of 2020. She said, there's been an alarming increase in the number of things I know nothing about. And I have to tell you personally, I had done years of in-person facilitation for groups ranging from youth and 4-H and youth development type programs to corporate entities. And in the process, switching to virtual was challenging. And you're seeing that challenge today. My internet is pretty sketchy. I live basically at the end of the internet superhighway. Dan's got high speed, which is why he's sharing screen today. But I had to get current on a lot of different things. And one of the ways we did that was to bring a group together. And of all the things I learned in our virtual group, probably one of the most powerful is this concept of connection before content. We started today's program by having a coloring book page and allowing people to join in and log in and add to the coloring on the page. But the idea of creating some connection between the people who are actually part of the program. If you launch right into it, or you don't allow chat, or you don't allow people to interact, I think the connection is less. And you have that choice about whether you have synchronous or asynchronous kind of presentations. I like the ones where people can interact. And when I first started to do this, I was given the opportunity to work with a corporate group. And they said, hey, Jim, we usually do an informal check-in at the start of our programs. Every person, mentions something personal and professional that's happened to them in the last week, and that's how we begin. And we had 8 people who were part of the group, and the first person spoke for 11 minutes. And it basically ate up all the time we had. So I tried to find a very convenient way to allow people to check in that didn't necessarily take up a lot of time, and created this thing we call connection before content. So on the page that has the word soapbox on it, I just created 4 quick questions that people could do fairly rapidly. And I'll do this and give Dan a chance as well. And this will give you an opportunity to see how this plays out. My name is Jim, and I prefer to be called Jim. A unique skill that I have to share is I have the unique ability to go into any room and create chaos in just a few minutes. You can count on me today to share with you some really, I think, engaging activities and ways to include an audience and do things that are active and fun and memorable on the internet. And what I know now that I didn't know before COVID-19, I'm in the category of people who learned how to cut their own hair during the pandemic. Dan, what's your soapbox speech?
Thanks for asking. My name is Daniel John Miller, but I prefer to be called Dan for sure, and definitely not Danny. And a unique skill that I've been playing around with in the world of facilitation is to incorporate, you see behind me, a lot of musical instruments. And I've really enjoyed getting groups to figure out how to make music together as part of some of the work that I do. You can count on me to bring some fun, some irreverence, some absurdity, and like Jim, I'm a big fan of chaos, to a program in support of learning and growth. And what I know now that I didn't know before COVID-19 is that virtual facilitation can be so much more than all the webinars of just talking heads on a screen that was kind of happening as we got into that time period. But really, some deep and meaningful interaction is possible, even if we're not in the same room. Excited to talk more about that today.
So this technique allowed our group to kind of check in fairly rapidly. And on the next slide, you'll see this great picture. This is some of the members of our virtual facilitation practice group. We got together with people who were real world in-person facilitators, and we just started trying stuff on stage there. And you'll see a graphic. Dan Miller is actually boxed in there. And I'm Jim Cain in the black shirt, just to the upper left of where Dan is located at. The other people who were part of our group there were all talented in the real world. And we started practicing things. For example, just to the left of Dan, you'll see a fellow whose hand is kind of blurred there named Jeff Goldberg. Jeff actually ended up leading poetry, an activity with us where he found a random number generator, like a giant prize wheel, wrote words on it. They would spin, they would create 5 words. And then the group would write poetry from it. And I have to tell you, as an in-person facilitator, I never really considered adding poetry to my programs, but Jeff made it accessible. And this group, I think, was so talented that we actually got together and we created a book that we called The Learning Curve, which was talking about the steep learning curve that those of us who were real world found when we started doing things in the virtual world. Some things didn't work. But the good news is there were a lot of things that did. For example, you don't have to worry about things like gravity in the virtual space. You can actually operate on distant planets and do things in unusual places that weren't possible in the real world. So we got together and we created our first book called The Learning Curve, which talked about all the things we learned probably in about the first 6 months of the lockdown and the shutdown for the pandemic. And then I'm going to have Dan show you, we actually got good enough that after a year or so, people said, well, I've learned a lot more. And we wrote a second volume. Dan, you want to chat about that?
Yeah, it's on the screen now. This one just came out earlier this year and is, I'd say, just another look, maybe a more mature look, having been through it a little bit longer, at what really works and creates experiential education in the virtual space. All the folks in that picture that Jim was just showing you, I think would proudly call themselves experiential educators. There was a time when all of our programs first got canceled that we wondered if it was the end of what we do, which is usually bringing large groups of people uncomfortably close together for long periods of time. So we were kind of forced to figure some stuff out. And yeah, here to tell you, it's never going to be back the way that it was. There's a lot that can be done virtually. It's a great way to balance work that's being done in person or stretch things out over a long period of time. And in this book, you'll find things ranging from specific virtual activities that you can facilitate to more conceptual, how to set up yourself as more of a producer than just a facilitator, which is new territory for a lot of us.
Also, there's information in there on additional websites, things like Mural and other sites we went to, Flippity.com, and there's places that have unique things that you can share with your audiences. But two of the kind of factors that came out, our friend Kirk Weisler came up with a phrase that I thought was important. He said, the bar is pretty low. There wasn't a lot of high level skill in the virtual space, and people appreciated anything that you did. So for example, that little coloring activity we started with, people just really liked that, and they found a way to engage and work. And the second quote that I really like, and this is the one that changed how I viewed virtual facilitation, is that the goal of a virtual activity is not to replicate a real world activity in virtual space, but to replicate the outcome of that activity. So in other words, it wasn't just a direct transfer from things we do in virtual space or real world space to virtual, but can we replicate the outcome? And I'll give you an example in this next picture. There's a fellow here, and one of the real world activity I have for kind of an introduction activity is called Wrapped Around My Finger. There's a long piece of flat rope there, a piece of webbing, about 15 feet long. And this person's been asked to talk about themselves until they finish wrapping. Now in virtual space, I suppose I could mail out one of those to each person that was involved, but it's a lot easier just to ask them to use things that they already have access to, like a shoelace or a piece of string or something that already exists. Office supplies are a good example, index cards, things that they can easily have access to. So we're not necessarily replicating the same thing in a virtual space, but we're replicating outcome by giving people a chance. Now, one of the things that I like to do is I have a series of cards that have interesting questions on them. And on those question cards, all I did to make it virtual was I wrote a few of the questions onto a slide. And now with groups like Zoom, you can put people into various subgroups, and you can put them into breakout rooms, and you can actually post these questions in those breakout rooms now. All that didn't exist initially, but Zoom, thank goodness, has gotten better over the years and taken people's ideas. So now you can have people interact with the questions on here. So let me ask my co-presenter Dan here. Dan, would you describe a perfect day?
Yeah, a perfect day involves sleeping as long as I want to. It involves breakfast around 10, because I am just always a little irritated that breakfast has to happen too early, in my opinion. And then after a delicious breakfast with probably some variation of biscuits and eggs and the classics, I would spend a lot of time outdoors, and I'd spend a lot of time with my little 9-year-old girl. And I could go on and on, Jim, but I think you get the idea.
I do. And now there's also another way to use this, and I'm going to have those of you who are joining us today type your answer in the chat for this. What's the most unusual thing you have ever eaten? And you can type that in the chat and hit return when you have it there. And that's a fun way when you have large audiences to see the kind of things that people have conceived along the way.
Yep.
When I first started looking at my list of in-person things, I started creating what I call, for my preferred playlist of activities, I started thinking, okay, which one of these things would transfer themselves into the virtual world? I wrote a book during the pandemic called Extraordinary Facilitation, where I gave people a chance to look at the best practices of how to become a better facilitator. And I realized that some of the things I was professing for real world in-person events also applied into virtual space. There's even a chapter in the book that covers those things. But if you start looking at things you like to do in the real world, it's fairly simple to circle the ones and make a list of things that also work in virtual space. Question. So how do you get good at being a virtual facilitator? Not just competent, but really kind of talented, maybe even masterful in the practice. And it's like the joke about how you get to Carnegie Hall. The answer is you practice. And if you practice long enough and hard enough, you might even become an expert, which is a good thing. Now, the thing that was really interesting to me was just in the same way that I made mistakes early in my career in real world facilitation, I made some mistakes in the virtual world too. And I like this quote by Michael Jordan that says, I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed. So let me give you a little insight, and this is brought out in the books as well. My first major failure in virtual facilitation was I took a real-world in-person activity, which is called 4 in a row, where you give two different teams different colors of balls, and you ask them to place them into a Coca-Cola bottle case. There's 24 slots, there's 24 balls. Whoever gets 4 in a row, you count those up. Whoever gets the most wins. And I had access to a professional designer for a corporation who rendered some beautiful tennis balls, three-dimensional. They had a shadow. They were incredible, but they were about 4 megabytes each, which means to load the graphic that you see in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, which is now reduced in size, but to load that initially for some people who were on dial-up took almost 20 minutes. So one of the first mistakes I made in virtual facilitation was having graphics that were just way too high resolution, at least in terms of what people's screens were. You know, we had people signing in from their cell phones that were only seeing, a fraction of the screen. So I replaced those with yellow dots, and they worked just fine. Dan, did you have any initial faux pas in your foray into virtual?
For me, I think it was really, and I'll talk about this a little more in a moment, but just not paying attention to the space that I was in and getting sucked into like, all right, we're on Zoom or we're on Teams and that's all we have. Whereas after I thought about it a little bit, and I was using a green screen a lot, partly because as you can see, my office is also my bedroom, is also my music station, is also my entertainment center. And I don't know, I didn't feel like people needed to see that, but I changed my space to actually make it kind of interesting and even framing it as like, this is what people are going to see when they come to a workshop. Let's make it interesting and real, because that's not a green screen. Those are my real guitars. That's my real keyboard. Just behind me here, oh, you can't quite see it, is my real hand pan drum, which maybe I'll play for you a little bit later. But taking advantage of the actual physical space that we're in was something I didn't do until I had been practicing for a while.
And I don't think I can underestimate this, but we were surrounded by creative people who would just try stuff. So I think we moved forward in this technique of virtual facilitation by having a lot of creative people who are willing to say, well, have you considered this? Or have you tried this? When we did, good things happened. Now, when John Naisbitt wrote a book called Megatrends way back in 1982, he said that in a world filled with technology, people really long for personal human contact. So what we wanted to find was, when we were presenting virtually, was to find ways to engage the senses of people in our audience. We have a friend named John in California who did a virtual wine tasting where they mailed out people and then they did things online, so they got the sense of taste into that. Smell, vision, sight, touch. Can you do those kind of things? Dan has a neat slide that kind of talks about these three possibilities.
Sure. So when I was trying to think of how to train people, I like to take concepts and make them as digestible as possible. And this is where I ended up with: how can we facilitate engagement and keep people interested and coming back when at times, I've done 8-hour-a-day Zoom trainings for 4 or 5 days in a row with folks. And I know to a lot of us, that sounds like it might be a nightmare. But I swear to you, on day 5, these folks were excited to come back, and looking forward to, what was going to happen that day. And I think the way that I've found to keep folks kind of reeled in is to think of virtual facilitation in these 3 realms. And I'll throw up a document in the chat when I get done chatting, so you all can have this as well. But breaking it down into what I was just talking about, first and foremost, right? Let's not get too sucked into the fact that we are on a virtual meeting platform and that's all we have. We all have physical space. And there's a lot of activities you can do to take advantage of that. Things you've probably seen, or, hey, find something close to you right now that, has some sentimental value. And if you have a smaller group, everybody can talk about it. Or if you have a larger group, you can throw it in the chat. Simon Says is one of my favorite activities to do virtually. And I do like the Michelle Cummings, Scott Gerst version where nobody gets out, but it's also pretty darn tricky and people will get points. And you'll see a lot of interesting reactions to a game like that people calls on you to raise your hands and move over here, and just using that physical space, telling people to go take a lap around their house in the middle of the day. Seems crazy, but can be just what you need to break up the monotony of a virtual meeting. I've even had people, hey, let's take a half an hour break, and during this time, choose one other person, get their phone number, go out for a walk and talk to them while you're walking. So we created breakout rooms outside, off the platform, even though it was a full day of Zoom training. So there's a lot you can do if you consider how to use the actual physical space, how to encourage people to move their bodies every 60 to 90 minutes at a minimum. And then once you've looked into what you can do in that space, start thinking about all the things that exist on your virtual platform. In the book, we go a lot further into the details of this, but just Zoom alone has features like annotate, breakout rooms, chat, and raising your hand and doing reactions. And so even these days, when you feel like most of your participants are pretty familiar with the platform and you don't have to train them how to do it, you probably should, because you're going to train them how you want them to use the platform. So today we're telling folks, hey, we're going to have Q&A at the end, but feel free to put questions and comments in the chat as we go. If you have something you really want to say during our kind of main portion, click the raise your hand feature, and that'll get you up to the top of the line. We'll see what you have to say. Every time you're using the platform, you probably want to use it a little bit differently, depending on your outcomes and depending on your group. And so, yeah, go ahead, Jim.
So now we're going to go fairly quickly through a series of things you can do.
Oh, wait, one moment. There's one more realm, which is everything else. So Jim was just talking about Mural. Jim was talking about Flippity, which I showed you really briefly, a wonderful platform to bring things visually to life. And there's a whole list of Jamboard, Miro, Google Earth, Mentimeter, Google Slides, documents that people can collaborate on the same time. And bouncing between those 3 different places, to me, is really the key to keeping things engaging and novel and possible for long periods of time on virtual space. That's it. Go ahead.
And Dan and I are willing to share this slideshow. You'll see the recording here, but if you would like this actual slide deck, you can't email us in the chat, but if you email us in real life, and we'll give you our email later on, we're happy to send it to you. It's a big file. We'll send it via WeTransfer. But let me show you some of the ways that we engage people in their senses. So this first picture with the sunlight streaming through the window is an alphabet room. And every letter of the alphabet is in here, A, B, C, D, all the way through. You'll see some of them scattered about. Some are a little harder to find than others. And this was just one of the images I found by looking at hidden figures on the internet and hidden shapes. And the next slide, you'll see a slightly different room. Same thing. The entire alphabet is in there somewhere. And getting groups, you could annotate, you could circle these things, you could make great things happen. But there's lots of these images available on the internet you can borrow for your presentation. I wanted to get people chatting about the possibilities. So I found a list of all the toys that I grew up with. And again, there's images for more recent ones than my generation by the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But there's a lot of fun toys on here. And this created dialogue. Maybe you do this as 5-minute fillers in your program. You've been doing a presentation and you want to get the group engaged a bit. Just a fun way to have people remember some of the pleasant moments from their childhood. I also collected from my library a series of television show theme songs that I could share audio, like Dan is sharing video right now, and play clips from various TV shows, and then have people answer in the chat which show they thought that was part of. So that was an interesting way to get groups engaged from an auditory standpoint. The next thing is I discovered that there was a school teacher in the East who was starting to create virtual things for the teachers in their school district and found really cool ways to go from a Google spreadsheet to create things that you'd like to do. How do you create a quiz show or a game board? My favorite on here is called the Flippity Scavenger Hunt, which is a preloaded template that already has some questions that you can replace with the questions you want to do. So in the next slide, here's an example. In the 2020 movie of Eurovision, Will Ferrell and the people in that group sing a song, and it won an Oscar, a music award for this one. But I asked the question, what's the number of the roadway that passes through that town? And the next slide shows what that looked like in the actual thing. And I created a musical scavenger hunt. So every question had a music video, and you can link to YouTube inside of Flippity. People have a chance to explore different music styles and tastes. For me, it was just really fun. And the answer on this one is that Route 85 passes through Husavik in Iceland, which is a neat thing. So there's ways you can incorporate things. And of all the platforms out there, and there are many that are good, I just thought Flippity, first of all, it's free. The things are pre-made. It was easy. I created this entire musical scavenger hunt in about 45 minutes, including all the hints. On the next slide, you can give people puzzles and things to solve online, and then invite them to unmute themselves and share. For example, in this one, there's a series of 6 locks here, and the question is, which lock do you have to remove so the entire shackle comes apart and you can make things happen? And I'm guessing this is probably behind some kind of a strip mall someplace, and the answer is any of them. Any of these 6 locks, if you open it up, the rest of it comes apart and you can open the container. But again, these are kind of visual things. And you think, well, I'd like to get a little more movement in the audience. So I love this piece of graffiti that says it's time to dance. I created an activity where I invited people to go online and learn the dance steps to something like the Cupid Shuffle or the Cha-Cha Slide, something fairly simple, and then played the music. And people literally, we did this with a youth conference in Pennsylvania with over 400 kids present, and people got a chance to dance together, line dances, but they had a chance to move. And it's not the only way to get people moving. So the next slide, you'll see a thing about bringing physical movement to virtual learning. Marcia Tate had a phrase that I really like. She goes, as your brain gets number, as the bottom gets number, your brain gets dumber. And it's great to get people up and moving, because a lot of us were deciding that early on, we were spending a lot of time sitting in our desks. So you can do things like virtual line dancing. You can do a pre-event scavenger hunt where you tell people, grab a laundry basket. I want you to collect one item for every letter of the alphabet from A to Z. And then afterwards, they're going to have to retrace those steps and replace them. So there was a way, for example, for teachers to engage their students by doing some of these things. So many of the forms of stretching, Qigong, yoga, Tai Chi, and things like that, you can get people to do in place. An activity called the story stretch, where one person leads the stretch and the other people all emulate that. These were all opportunities for people to use that component and get a little bit of physical movement and make it a little bit less static. One of my favorite things that I created during the pandemic was this. you'll see this picture with Batman at the top. Here's objects, and there's a natural sequence to how these things go together. So I would just invite you to name in the chat. Can you tell me what connects all these objects currently shown on the screen? You'll see a giant red dice in the middle. There's an electrical plug and some other things. Can you guess how it is that all these objects are linked? When we get people talking in the chat room today, most people are muted, but you can type in the chat what you think is kind of going on. And you start to get hints like, for example, well, I see Elvis Presley there. What does he have to do with the Pentagon? And what you quickly realize in this scenario is this is a deck of cards. Ace hardware. Elvis Presley was a king. On the left side, you'll see the rock group Queen. In the lower right, there's a jack. Then you look at other things like, for example, a dime, that's a 10. The domino is the 9. The Styx album is called Pieces of 8. The pill container has 7 sections to it. The dice is 6, the pentagon's 5. 4 on the floor on the gear shift knob. 3 prongs on the electrical plug, and the dynamic dual. So there's a full deck of cards that you can quiz people on. And there's lots of puzzles or rebuses or things that people do.
Jim, I wish you could see some of the facial expressions going on while you just went over that puzzle. A lot of furrowed eyebrows and then a lot of interesting reactions when you gave away.
Nice. Another name for these kind of puzzles is called a rebus. So if you look for puzzles and things, and we use a lot of children's books, the Book of Games and other things, we found ways to bring these to life. Let me show you a few more of these that are kind of fun. One is I did a lot of musical clips and vision from things and asked people, what movies they came from. So in this one, you'll see Mikhail Baryshnikov in White Knights, Titanic, Harry Potter is on there. You've got Mail. We could show clips of scenes. We could show images from those parts of the world. Then we started getting into the new and fascinating world of AI. So in the next clip, you're going to see what they call the blueberry muffin chihuahua phenomenon. And in artificial intelligence, the ability of AI to pick out the differences between these things, or what I really like is the dog and the fried chicken scenario. And there are other ones that have people on here. So we started getting, and this was fairly late in the process, I think, but we started looking at some of the fascinating things you could do with AI. And so last week, for example, I typed in the phrase, the Creativity Expert Exchange 2023. And this is the picture that I got using Crayon, which is an AI image generator from text, which I thought was fairly creative. And I typed in another phrase into this thing, and I asked for Elvis water skiing, just something rampant. And you can see, the images in it. There are websites that do a lot better than this, but for just quick and cheap and dirty, I just tried to, try something like this to see. And so having people create images, and there's a lot of really fun things you can do. So if I typed in Dan Miller, Mona Lisa, I would probably come up with something that was fairly close to both of those as a combination. How about you, Dan? Have you played much in the AI field?
Yes. If I open up that can of worms right now, I might keep talking for the rest of the thing. But I'll just say that I've had a lot of fun with it, and Chat GPT as well. If you're just brainstorming, you can tell Chat GPT that you're about to run an experiential education program for a group of 20 facilitators who want to talk about virtual facilitation, and it'll give you an outline in 2 seconds. It's kind of fascinating. Not as good as what we come up with for sure, but it's still pretty neat.
Yeah, a lot of good things there. The other thing is, whatever you're using for your video conferencing software, I kind of got hooked on Zoom early on. I liked its efficiency. Microsoft Teams were part of that, WebEx. There's a lot of possibilities out there. Whatever you do, I got a piece of advice that I thought was really valuable. Whatever you have, try to break it. And what I mean by that is push every button in that platform and learn what it does. So it took me a while, for example, to learn how to share audio, or how to share my screen, or how to load things in breakout rooms, and how to time them, and how to let people know about those things. But learn as much as you can. There are video filters and things in Zoom. Not every platform has exactly the same things. But whatever you try to do 2 things. Learn all the buttons inside of it and make sure you update it, because even things like Zoom continues almost on a weekly basis to have new and talented things you can do that are fun. So update those when you can. Now, the big question is, so when does virtual reality become just reality? That's the way we do things. So we started looking ahead just a bit into the whole world of this. And this graph shows the image of what happens. You know, at the start of the pandemic, when people were doing most of our work in person, there was a rapid decline in that and an increase in the amount of the virtual space. And the question is, what happens later in life? You know, as the pandemic wanes, are we going to have more real world things? I think the fact that people have gotten familiar with virtual world means it's going to be around a lot longer. But just to give you an idea, I had a chance in June of last year to work with Microsoft out in Seattle, Washington. It was kind of one of those glamour gigs that I got. And one of the managers came from the UK, took him 3 flights to get to Seattle. And one of the things he told me at the end was, he said, you know, we're tired of virtual. It's time and it's much better to be together in real life. And I thought, you guys are Microsoft. I mean, you create the software to do this kind of stuff. And he says, yeah, but in terms of creating teams, so much more that can happen in real world space. So one of the thoughts I had was a project I call the best of both worlds, where we start looking at activities and things we can specifically do in the real world, in the virtual world, and in the hybrid universe. Things that work everywhere. Because in the future, I see both real world and virtual world gatherings with one taking precedence over the others based upon the needs and desires of the people planning those events. Facilitators that are capable in both realms are going to maintain the relevance because they have those unique skill sets. They can function in the real world, in the virtual world, and the hybrid universe. It's not easy in the hybrid universe, and quite frankly, it takes more bandwidth from a presenter to keep a hybrid audience engaged. But I think some good things happen. What I'd like to do at this point is to tell you just 2 things, and I'm going to skip over 2 slides there, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think Dan and I consider ourselves experts, but I think we're way more than competent at this point. So here's a couple of things that can help you as we kind of wrap up our time together today. First of all, I like this quote from Robert Schuller that says, when you've exhausted every possibility, remember this, you haven't. ChatGPT didn't exist, 6 months ago. Literally every week, somebody comes out with new things. Let me give you an example of this next one. I do a series of debriefing activities after my work, and I do a fortune cookie debrief, for example. Now, Dan is sharing screen, but if he was only sharing, for example, the actual PowerPoint presentation, not the shared part of it, you could actually move these fortune cookies on screen, and behind them, you could see a question on each and every fortune cookie. So people could click on one, the facilitator could move it, and that would give them a question. There's also a series of team performance images that were created by a friend of mine named Dave Nobby that he calls thumbprints. And we can ask people to annotate this and say, could you put a mark on the screen that is how our team is functioning right now? But let's give you one that's actually going to engage you for a second. I'd like you to summarize your experience in this workshop this afternoon in just 6 words using the chat feature, but don't hit return. Just type them in, but don't send them just yet. 6 words. They could be individual words, they could form a sentence. 6 words about your experience today. Go ahead and type those in the chat. And then in a minute, what we're going to do is a thing called a chatterfall, like a waterfall. We're going to ask you to all hit send at the same time. And these are going to scroll by on the screen. So you'll be able to read everybody's 6-word stories, their experience here today. So I'll give you a few more sections. You can have less than 6 words. That's fine too. But here we go. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Go ahead and hit send. And these are the 6-word stories from the people who are present here today.
Jim, I'm seeing a lot of fun stories, including words like informative, daunting, fun stuff, entertaining, expanding possibilities, and on and on.
Nice. Typically, when I do a program at the very end of things like this, I would put people in a chat room and I have them talk about what they've learned today and how they can use it in their daily life. We're going to skip that component today, but I think it's a valuable way because, again, it's the connection at the beginning and the connection at the end. People get a chance to interact with people. That's a good thing. Now, if you'd like to email me, my name is Jim Cain, and you can email me at jimcain@teamworkandteamplay.com. Dan's going to show a slide with his email.
Yep, it's got both of us on there. I'm Dan at Fifth Pillar Consulting is my business, and I love talking about this stuff. You can reach out anytime, even if it's just like, hey, what's a cool activity that would go here? If I'm available, I will answer. If I'm not, I won't. So feel free to communicate.
So on behalf of Dan Miller and myself today, we'd like to thank you virtually and in the real world too. And if you'd like a copy of this slide deck, like I said, please feel free. My internet is down today, but it'll be up soon. And we're willing to share this slide deck just as a starter, so you can continue to do these kind of things that engage folks. And I think I plan at this point, we're going to, we'll disengage. And I can hear you. I'd like to open it up to the group for questions you might have. You can type them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and share with that. But thanks so much for being part of our program today. And if we can help you in any way, please contact us and we'd be glad to.
Yeah, I echo that. It's great to get to hang out with y'all, but I'd love to hear, we have a few more minutes of what are some questions that you have or curiosities. And you can unmute yourself and just come out and chat, or you can put them in the actual chat on Zoom, whatever your preference. There's a great question here, Jim, from, oh no, it's getting to there. So from Rustin, of how we employ some of these activities without incurring the cynic's eye roll.
Well, early on, it was easy. I mentioned the phrase that the bar was pretty low. People were just so grateful for anything that was engaging in the process. And I can tell you this, I see more of the cynic's eye roll when people present, but they don't have interactivity. Interaction, quite frankly, I think helps with that. And the other thing you can do is what I call divide and conquer. You can put people into smaller breakout rooms where they get a chance to interact with people. And, you know, one curmudgeon in a breakout room is fairly accessible to the people who are in that breakout room to assist them. Where if they're part of a giant group, it's real easy to get lost in that. And I think feel disconnected. How about you, Dan? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, some of the classic skills that make us, you know, good at what we do, and I mean all of us, is choosing activities and sequencing them in a way that makes sense for the group that we're working with. And so I will often do some pretty light stuff like those alphabet seek and find, or visual seek and find, or even name that tune or something as people are just coming on, to just kind of lower the distance between us. And then pretty quickly, especially using tools like Mural and Mentimeter is one of my favorites, a kind of visual polling software. You can actually go surprisingly deep and real very quickly. And for me, a lot of the nuances in, you may do something that can easily be tagged as cheesy, but then the way that you debrief it, or the meaning that you help people draw from it, will turn any skeptic into a believer if that part of it is done well, right? We may have just played Simon Says, but all of a sudden we're talking about the emotions behind our, you know, automatic reactions. And now we're talking about emotional intelligence, and now we're talking about empathy, and now we're talking about leadership. And so you can take anything that somebody may roll their eyes at, and through the magic of what we do as facilitators, you can find some real meaning and get them on board. It's been my experience. If I'm really playing to a kind of stuffier group, I'll customize what we do to fit that group. And you can bring out the kid in anybody, even a bunch of CEOs looking at those toys from the 70s and 80s or 60s, like that will just surprise you with how much it might soften someone up.
I think Dan's comment, though, about sequencing is absolutely true. If you, for example, the line dancing thing, if we had started today's program with that, I think we probably would have lost people, you know, in the process. So doing that at the right place when you prepared the group for what's happening, and finding ways to engage groups. So splitting into smaller groups and breakout rooms is great. And here's the good news. Life is a giant social experiment. Your job is to try stuff and then evaluate how it works for you. I've done activities at the end of my programs, and my thought was, I wonder if this would work near the beginning. And if you try it and it does, then that gives you more flexibility. And if it doesn't, then you know this really needs to fit here. So to try things is probably a valuable thing. Other questions?
Yeah, Jim, another one that's up on the chat is asking a little more about hybrid. And is there a portion of in-person versus, or I'm getting like a ratio of in-person to remote participants that works best for hybrid? And my immediate thought when talking about hybrid events, I'm going to try to paraphrase John Losey, but I'm probably going to get it wrong. And it's something like virtual first. And Jim, I don't know if I can remember, but it's very much about, if you're making a hybrid event, consider in everything that you do, like, how are the virtual people engaged first? Because that's often what gets lost. A lot of the hybrid events that I've done have been in-person events with like a little window that people in the virtual space get to look through. I'm seeing a lot of head nods. But also just participated in Tom Leahy's National Challenge Course Practitioner Symposium, which was a hybrid event with both in-person and virtual presenters. And because there was a lot of attention paid, there were screens, big ones, more than usual, so that people in person could see us. There were multiple cameras in each room so that we could see different angles of them and see who was speaking. There were microphones that were intentionally placed. It's hard to do it well. It's one of the harder kind of events to facilitate. But I think where it usually goes wrong is that virtual participants are not really shepherded through the process very well.
My impression is this, it's harder on the facilitator. You now have to watch multiple audiences, not just the one directly in front of you. People who run programs like it because now they can have a wider audience. I can have somebody from Singapore in my event. Now, for that Singapore person right now, it's about 3 o'clock in the morning. So you have to understand where they're at. And I don't know that people who attend in person versus virtually have a similar experience. But sometimes that's part of the merit of it. Okay, if I don't have to get on a plane, I can attend virtually. You know, if you're listening to a keynote speaker and it's not an interactive event, then I think both hybrid, you know, and real world in person and virtual work. But if you're doing an activity that's interactive, I'm not sure people have the same experience. So the good news is, like we did with virtual, we're going to get better at these things. And the software is going to continue to improve and interactivity is going to work up. I may not have great internet today, but I'm told that we're going to have fiber internet before the end of the summer, and that's good news. You know, and people will get better at these kind of skills. So when we practice, we'll get better at it. But I don't know that anybody does it exceptionally well yet. So there's a lot to be patient about currently in the hybrid world.
Kristen, I see that it's 2 o'clock and want to make sure folks have the out if they need it. Jim and I can hang out a little longer and keep doing this if you like.
So there is at 2:15 a state of the center talk that's happening back with Gerard in the main room. But I'm happy to hang out here with you guys too and keep this open as long as Dan and Jim are willing.
Great. Well, to those of you that need to run, thanks so much for attending. There still are a few good questions in the chat. Jim, you all right hanging out for a little bit to go through them?
Yeah, we got another 10 minutes. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, you know, one comment that just sticks out that I think is worth putting out there is talking about using a producer, right? Kevin says, as a facilitator, right, to facilitate and manage the tech can be really challenging. And that's largely the role that I'm playing for Jim here today, sharing his slides, monitoring the chat. If we were doing breakout rooms, you just say it out loud and poof, it happens when you have a technically savvy producer. Also, they can help with program design and translating your vision into what works virtually. It's kind of opened up a whole new profession. And I find myself doing that a lot just because I love the tech. Hey, you got a program, but you don't want to have to manage all that stuff while you're doing your magic. Bring somebody on. There's a few of us out there that can be very handy to have around.
If things don't go well, they can always blame you.
Yeah,
So that's
exactly.
if you're facilitating, just blame the producer. It's not my fault, right?
Well, and I
Totally.
think to your point, Dan, one of the things that I always think about is that reading the room. And when you are facilitating and trying to manage the tech, it's sort of like, I feel like you're missing that extra skill. So having that producer here who really is watching.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be really taxing for facilitators and participants. Seeing if you're in gallery mode right now and you're looking at, 12 talking heads and a bunch of pictures of individuals, like your brain's not used to that. And it really is extra work. Like you feel it at the end of a long day in these meetings, right? Because your brain's putting in extra work to look at all the faces and try to make meaning from what you see, which is just really different. We have other things to look at when we're in person. And it can really take a lot out of you. It's also helpful for when things go wrong. Just a quick story is I was producing a Zoom event and we put people into breakout rooms and we couldn't get them out. It was a whole new problem to encounter, but they were not coming out of them. There was 180 people in this event. And so to be the person in charge of everything and to have to figure out that would have been a disaster. But, in the end, we had to just turn it off and turn it on again. And
the universal reset.
Yeah.
The other thing is, and Dan kind of touched on this here too, this is a great opportunity to co-facilitate with somebody else. First of all, you're going to learn the skills that they have. It also gives you a chance occasionally to grab a drink of water and view the group and see what's happening. But co-facilitation, I mean, what a brilliant thing to do in terms of increasing your own skills and getting feedback. Dan and I were part of this virtual group for a number of years, but we have had real world in-person events in the last year where we got together. And I can tell you that we formed friendships with people in our facilitation group that we had never met in real life. So it is possible to do those things. But next time you do a program like this, absolutely bring somebody along with you. I just think it enhances the experience and it takes the pressure out. Like today, my internet wasn't working well, but Dan's is, and we can get the job done. So that takes a lot off your mind, knowing that you have a backup. And if you're the kind of person like me who traditionally works independently, it's just a neat opportunity. For me, it's not necessarily easier. I just think it's a lot more fun.
Amen.
Dan, if you read that first question from Sarah?
The last one about pricing. Yeah. My personal quick response to that is there is a lot of variables that come into pricing for different people, different programs, different platforms. If you want to talk about that, Sarah, I would welcome you reaching out to Jim or I. And there's another question that we also haven't gotten to that I think fits pretty well to wrap up this session. So I'm sorry, Sarah, that I'm not going to open up that can right now, but I will with you. I promise. I'm pointing at you right now on my screen. Is just how do you hone and practice these skills? Right? We're talking about so much stuff. It's a fire hose of information, but you really need, it's like playing an instrument. You need to get your muscles to be able to do it themselves for the most part. And Jim's been talking about this practice group that we were a part of. People are still offering virtual practice groups. I know John Losey's doing them. A fellow out in California with a program called Voltage Control has a group of probably 200 or 300 people who get together regularly. And I was facilitating during the pandemic. I called it the BFE gathering, the best family ever. I got my cousins, my uncles, my aunts, my grandmas and people like, hey, I want to try some stuff. And they showed up and I learned a lot before I had a paying audience through just trial and error with friends and relatives. I've had numerous facilitators send an email out to me and a few of our friends to say, hey, there's this activity. I need to try it out. Can somebody meet me in 20 minutes? And 6 or 7 of us show up right then and there. So it's really just practicing it in a maybe low pressure environment, playing around with stuff. And like Jim said, push all the buttons until you break it. But do that before you have the more real audience. Jim, you have thoughts?
No, I'm just grateful to the Creativity Institute. They've been doing great work for decades, and Dan and I are pleased to be part of it today. Please reach out to us. Let us know if you'd like a copy of the presentation. Let me or Dan know, and we will definitely send you this whole thing. Our goal was to share what we learned, and everyone in our creativity group shared so freely. We're happy to continue that trend and let you get started just with the great things we've shared today. So thanks again.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Jim. This has just been fantastic, and we're barely even scratching the surface with you two.
Mhm. It's true, but this was a good start.
Well, thank you all. We will, as you said, hang out here for a little bit longer. Otherwise, you're welcome to join Gerard having a talk on the update on the center, or we'll see you back tomorrow morning.
Outstanding. We'll see you then.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
So Jim, I suspect we're not that far away from each other. You said Western New York.
I'm in Brockport, just on the west side of Rochester.
Oh, okay.
Kristen, do you want to pause the recording at this time?
Yes, thank you.
Yep, I know how it goes. I'm just glad you remembered to start it. That's the hard part.
Well, good. I'm hoping this won't be the last time we have a chance to work and play together.
Yeah, I'm always looking for excuses to come up to Buffalo and hang out with